But there was this instance that happened for me when I was living up in Sheffield that did introduce a radical new idea to me, and it did happen indeed while I was having a haircut. I, at this point, was traveling mainly throughout Europe, a few parts of the Middle East speaking, and I'd been invited to North America, and I didn't know much about the North American church, but I did understand that if I wanted to be accepted there, I'd have to have neat hair. And so I went off to go and have my hair cut in preparation for this great odyssey. We lived in a small town at that point, my wife and I, called Worksop. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's really the cultural epicenter of Great Britain. And I simply walked down about 100 yards to the corner of my road, and there was a small hairdressing salon there that I hadn't been in before. And I walked in, and behind the welcome desk was a very tall and very pregnant-looking lady. And she greeted me, and I simply looked at her, and I said, well, and she said, how can I help you? And I said, well, I need a haircut. And she produced an appointment book. And she said, well, when were you thinking of coming? And so I looked at my watch, and I said, now. She looked at her book, and she looked at me, and she said, okay, if we're quick, I can fit you in. I said, that's no problem. I don't have hairstyle. I just have hair, and it needs to be shorter. So she walked me across, and she sat me in a chair. She put an apron around me. She walked off. She picked up her comb and scissors, and she walked back. And as she stood behind me, she turned to the lady who was cutting hair next to me and said, my business is doing so well, but there must be more to life than this. And so I realized at this point this was obviously her shop. So as she turned round to cut my hair, I could now see her eyes in the mirror. So I caught her eye in the reflection, and I looked at her, and I said, you know, what you say is very true. In life, we're not made happy by what we acquire, but by what we appreciate. It's something I'd read in my devotion that morning, and she stared at me. And she said, what did you just say? I said, in life, we're not made happy by what we acquire, but by what we appreciate. And she walked off. And she came back with a pad of paper and a pen, and she said, could you say that one more time? And she wrote it down. Now, at this point, she seemed to be interested, so I thought I would follow through, and I'd been preparing a sermon on worship that I preached the Sunday before. So I took one line from that, and I simply said to her, but if you ask me, the trouble we have today, it's not that we feel we have nothing to be grateful for, rather we feel there is no one to be grateful to. And she put down the comb and scissors, and she picked up her notebook and pen and said, could you say that one more time? And then she wrote it down. Now, it took her an hour and 15 minutes to cut my hair that day. She wrote everything down. We then began talking, and I said to her, have you ever been in love with someone and unable to tell them? I'd just been reading some C.S. Lewis. And she said, I have. I said, it's a terrible feeling, isn't it? She said, yes. I said, but if you're in love with someone, and you're able to express that love, and it's reciprocated to you, it brings a completeness that wasn't there before. And she said, I know exactly what you're talking about. I said, well, that's why, to me, worship is so important. I'm a Christian. I go to a local church just around the corner from here. I said, I find that worship brings a completeness to my life that otherwise would be missing. And at this point, she looked very solemn, and I say she was obviously pregnant, must have been at least 7.5 months pregnant. She then looked at me and she said, Michael, I'm so worried about bringing a baby into a world that is filled with so much evil. And so again, borrowing a line I'd heard from Ravi Zacharias, who'd actually borrowed it from someone else, I said, I know there's a lot of evil out there, but what about the evil in here? And then she simply stopped and she said, if there was a way to overcome evil in the human heart, that would be amazing. I said, it's interesting you say that. I said, we all feel that we want to change, but it feels like there's a power in our lives that controls us. She said, I know exactly what you mean. She said, I want to be a better person than who I am, but I can't. And so I looked at her and I said, well, the Bible calls that sin, you know. Have you ever heard that word? She said, yes. I said, well, sin isn't just something that describes what we do wrong. It also describes a power over our life. And she said, oh, you know what? I feel like I need someone to rescue me. And so I smiled and looked at her and I said, what you're telling me is you need a savior. And I'm not joking. She went, ooh, that's a good word. Because we don't use that word very often outside of the context of the church. She said, that's a good one. I said, let me explain to you who I think this Savior is. And so that then began this long conversation about who Jesus Christ was. He comes into this world free of sin and death. And then on the cross, he takes on the forces of sin and death. He dies for us. He becomes a curse for us. He becomes sin for us. He's raised to new life. He conquers over this. He offers this new life. She takes note on the whole thing. And at the end, she says, what should I do about this? And I said, well, you can't sit on the fence forever. You must make a decision.